Good morning. It's a privilege to be here with all of you. So I'm a water resources lawyer, so some of my comments will relate to different statutes and regulations and, of course, some policy, and then just observations that I have of where we started a little bit, where we are, and where agriculture might be going, at least here in California. So I will have to move rather quickly, just trying to capture some snapshots about yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Basically providing a little bit of a summary of water supplies, water use, putting that into the context of agriculture, the drought, and California's responses to these challenging circumstances with the drought, to then create somewhat of a forecast and a set of strategies or adaptation measures to help mitigate the challenges and the risks with water supplies. So for talking about yesterday, I will touch quickly on the supplies in use. Water rights themselves, and you'll see this again in a little bit, is not something that I think should be changed, and I'm happy to talk about that. That tends to create a little bit of a lively debate, but we'll come back to that in a few moments. Sources of water, for the most part in California and even elsewhere, are surface water supplies and groundwater. Here's a picture of what I think is a state water project here in California. California water use more or less could be distributed by this pie chart by quantifying approximately 50% of the supplies are for environmental needs, requirements, such as in-stream flow requirements, habitat preservation, restoration, delta outflows, things of that nature. With the other half mostly being agricultural use at 41% and urban use at approximately 10%. Urban use typically includes industrial uses, commercial uses, things beyond our household demands. So water rights, there's certainly no way I could really summarize water rights within just one slide. Here in California, we have common law water rights that are really a hybrid system that create complexities of all sorts by having what's called a riparian/overlying system, riparian for surface stream, overlying for groundwater, and the appropriative doctrines. And that probably relates back to kind of the 49ers era with mining and just some historical context and uses of the water that would help explain why we have this hybrid system. I like to distinguish water rights, whether it's a common law right like I was just describing or a permit that's received through the State Water Board. I like to distinguish those types of rights from contractual rights. Practically on day-to-day operations, for the most part, they might seem the same, but they do have different implications and different rights and responsibilities that come with them. Regardless, water is treated in California as a real property right. And by that, the land, such as this building is sitting on, that's how water is treated under California law. So it's usually part and parcel to the land. It runs with conveyances and transactions unless things are specifically contemplated or severed. But for the most part, it's treated as real property. And it's a usufructuary right, which essentially means that it's a right to use or possess, but the user or the water right holder does not actually own that water or the molecules of that water. It's essentially held in trust under the public trust doctrine and some other authorities by the state of California. And another big requirement that comes with water use, regardless of being a contractual right, a water right, is to use that water reasonably and beneficially. And those are two very distinct legal terms of art. But essentially trace back to cases going back to the 1800s, certainly a constitutional amendment that we had here in the state in 1928, and this becomes much more of a lively issue as water resource challenges increase with reduced supplies and increasing demands. And really, I think what gets to the heart of this term as well is recognizing the need to use non-potable water for non-potable uses. Easier said than done. There's not necessarily the infrastructure, and these things cost a lot of money. But the idea is to try to use non-potable supplies for non-potable uses. So agriculture. So looking at some recent statistics, I mean, the state's history of agriculture is very long and a great story. But for today's purposes, a few highlights that I thought were noteworthy is that California contributed to about 14.3% of the U.S.'s agricultural exports in 2014. California provides, for the most part, 1/3 of the United States' vegetable supply and 2/3 of its fruits and nuts supply. Almonds are in high demand. There's been a shift among some growers to almonds, and there's generally a good yield of profit margins. There's very high demand for it, and with efficient irrigation methodologies such as drip irrigation, it can help meet that balance between the business model that's being exercised by an agricultural grower and the competing demands for water supplies. So now transitioning into today, about the drought, California's responses, and what those impacts, or at least some of those impacts, have been so far on California and its growers. Pretty devastating images here on slide 9 that were taken by NASA through JPL, and I think Dr. Famiglietti in the next room was very instrumental in this process. And what you see are these images from 2002 to 2014, with somewhat of a self-explanatory story being told here of the groundwater change from 2002 to 2014, going from green to red. With that came a whole set of different orders coming out of the governor's office, regulations coming out of the state regulatory agencies, certainly local agencies, whether cities, water districts, other special districts, implementing conservation strategies that, for the most part, were already on the books for them through their water shortage contingency plans. And the essence of it, certainly for these first 3 bullets about the governor's orders and the surface water in this Siskiyou County case, were to act and act quickly, conserve. Whether that was being subject to up to 36% conservation that some water purveyors were subject to, or a general mandate that the governor passed down for a 25% mandate reduction by every water user in the state. Just recently, last month actually, the governor, I don't want to say relaxed that order, but had elected to defer to the local agencies to continue to do what that agency deems best for conservation measures. So there's been somewhat of a shift of these mandates going from state to local levels. Groundwater, of course, that's what we're here to talk about, and you've heard about SGMA throughout different presentations, but that is the key to which there is no crystal ball. It's unprecedented here in California with a whole series of different factual, technical, legal, regulatory, political dynamics that make it so that it's very challenging and is likely to work in some areas, but not so likely to work in different areas, for all of those different factors that go into it. But the essence of it is to reach what the regulations and the statutes define as a sustainability goal, and with that a sustainable yield. And really what that means is developing a water budget for a basin or a subbasin. And the idea is to allow local agencies to do this. So the state basically is saying, we would like local agencies, whether an existing city, water district, special district, to become what's called the Groundwater Sustainability Agency, and it can be a conglomerate of other agencies. There's different flexibility for it, but develop a plan, and there's different timelines depending on the characterization of a basin, but develop a plan so that within 20 years of that plan being implemented or adopted, there will be a sustainable basin yield. So that's happening now. That's a very live issue here in California for groundwater resources. And if these agencies, or a county who is presumed to be that agency, unless they opt out, does not step up to do that, or the county elects and does opt out, then the state will step in, and it becomes the backstop. So impacts to agriculture. There's been, with reduced surface water supplies, traditionally the reliance shifts to groundwater supplies. That has certainly happened. You saw that a few slides ago with the images that were taken by NASA and JPL. There's also been a shift in business models, talking and working with different growers where land application areas go into fallow, different lease arrangements are made, and essentially this statistic shows that over 500,000 acres were fallowed during 2015. There's also been labor cuts from local labor, but conversely, an increase in the H-2A guest worker program. So the labor supply source, more or less, has shifted a little bit to try to adapt to these impacts. So looking to tomorrow, I would characterize 2 big things as being game changers. One is climate change, one is SGMA. I'll then talk briefly about some general implications of these game changers, and then wrap it up with identifying some mitigation and adaptation measures. So climate change, I think for the most part, many recognize that regardless of causes and some of these issues that become political issues, there's been a change in hydrologic cycles. We've seen that here in California. I'm a recent transplant from Southern to Northern California, and certainly looking around the state, talking with different folks, and then seeing the Sierra snowpack this winter different than what we've seen for the last several years. There's certainly this change in the cycles. With that comes baseline changing. And by that I mean from more of a legal regulatory perspective is for land use planning, whether at the county or a city level. There's challenges for looking back in history to try to predict what needs to be done for future planning. And I think the California State Water Resources Control Board will face that challenge as new applications are submitted for appropriative permits or licenses. And again, not going back to the 1923 era, which is part of the historical record currently utilized. So SGMA certainly being a game changer. The statutes specifically say a water right remains a water right. So SGMA does not change what is a water right. But where I see a potential conflict coming is where you have an overdrafted basin that mandatorily needs to be brought back into balance. With that comes ramp downs, and there's likely to be individuals and entities thinking that those ramp downs infringe upon their water rights. So it becomes critical to engage in this process with these agencies, with development of their plans, implementation of the plans, to really try to avoid the disputes. So where these disputes cannot be resolved with that local governing agency, the Groundwater Sustainability Agency, then what's happened here in California may happen again with groundwater adjudications. We have about 22 different adjudications that are on the books with active judgments and active groundwater management occurring, most of those being in Southern California. So some general implications are we're in a new world of water resource management. Climate change requires developing new groundwater and surface water models. The previous speakers, it's always fascinating to talk with these engineers and experts so that people like me can learn and we work together, because this is a very collaborative type of field that requires that collaboration. So I think development of models is a critical piece. And with SGMA, the data collection is going to be necessary. I think there's going to be challenges with different individuals and entities concerned with how that information is going to be used. Is it a public record? Does it reveal things about my business that my competitors will then learn and see? And it potentially means paying more for less water with ramp downs, but then assessments being authorized to be levied by these sustainability agencies. It's essentially creating a little bit of a paradigm of potentially paying more for less water. Conservation is great, and as effective as it is not the sole source to help us weather these lack of storms or the next droughts that come in through the future. So some strategies, sources of new water or alternative water supplies. We hear about desalination. Carlsbad, a massive project, went online December 14th. I consider that a success. And that's a great source of supply to help diversify San Diego County and San Diego County Water Authority's portfolio. Recycled water, similarly, is a wave of the future. There are some legal and regulatory hurdles that we have here in California, but the legislature seems to each session try to work to try to remove some of those. In the oil and gas industry, the produced water aspect is something that I think will become a bigger issue in the coming years. And water transfers in a water market, I think, are just critical to helping create a nimbleness and a flexibility for resources to be used efficiently. And the key, I think, to avoid injury and avoid disputes would be to keep that water within the same basin or the watershed where it's being transferred from and ultimately used. So the rationale being to offset the increasing demands of population growth and shrinking supplies. I think another mitigation or adaptation measure is improving methods and practices. A simple point would be using drip versus pivot irrigation where feasible, and changing crop cycles, whether that's going from water-intensive crops with high crop duties to others and using drip irrigation. Ultimately, some growers, depending on where they are in the state, depending on their size and what their ambitions are, might just change their business model and transition the land to different crops or transition out of the business altogether for some kind of other use by another grower or even urbanization. So with that, I'm happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Very informative presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I do a lot of traveling throughout California, and I noticed throughout the last few years, Southern California has done an amazing job with conservation and reservoir constructions and preparing themselves for the inevitable. But what I also noticed is that the stress of the drought wasn't felt as much, surprisingly, in Southern California as it was in Northern California. It seemed that the people in Northern California were much more concerned about it. And it's a perception, I believe, because people see more reservoirs, they see water in them, they've saved their water, they've done a good job. But the perception of the public seems to be a very offsetting trend. And I'd like to know what your thoughts on that would be.
Well, it's a great point, and I think it opens up a topic that's full of controversy and different views. I mean, from my personal perspective, having relocated early last year from south to north, I'd always been teased by Northern California family or friends about the north-south split. I'm certainly involved with projects in the north, California Water Fix being one. So, I mean, that issue comes up quite heavily, is where is the water used, how is it used efficiently. I think there's been really kind of looking past some of the headline news and some of the perceptions. I mean, I think in reality, there has been a lot of responsible water resource management by a number of agencies around the state. I'm convinced of that. Of course, it kind of varies, but I think as a state as a whole, there has been responsiveness and even planning. I think what we see in the south is the reservoirs help, I think, provide a little bit more peace of mind because the reservoirs are there. And here we have more of our natural reservoirs. I mean, there's the federal set with Shasta, Oroville, Folsom, and then moving on down south through the Central Valley and along the Sierras. But I think because there are the reservoirs down south, it casts that appearance we're okay. But I wouldn't necessarily take that as being any more okay than someone in the north, because a lot of that water does come from the north, so the reservoirs are necessary. But I just think visually seeing it creates that peace of mind, when in reality, I think we're all in the same boat.
Thank you. Good presentation. Appreciate that. One thing you may not have addressed is the issue with environmentalists and the water going out to the ocean and how that could maybe affect and provide quite a bit more surface water to us. So, any comments there?
Sure. Another great topic. We saw this recently in the last few months with Folsom Reservoir alone in the Sacramento area, about 25 miles east of downtown Sacramento, where the federal government, through Department of Interior and specifically Reclamation, operate Folsom, and spilled water that became delta outflows basically did wash out to the ocean. Now, to some extent, there's very set rules in place that help control for flood. So after this great snowpack in Lake Tahoe and Sierra region coming down the American River and these other tributaries, I literally saw Folsom from Christmas Eve day and the holiday period be at its devastatingly low levels to now these recharged levels. So Folsom gets pushed hard by reclamation because it does have a high refill probability. But because of the flood control requirements, we're sort of out of balance because that water gets spilled and then it's not used and washing out. So I think that's a good example of where there's existing rules in place, not even necessarily for the environmental aspect, but that was flood control. And those rules, we need to reconcile that so there's a better balance and efficient use of it. On the environmental side, I mean, they're very similar challenges because there are existing requirements there, and especially with Bay Delta and various decisions.